I took the job at St. Luke's Cemetery because it paid in cash and nobody cared if I kept to myself. The grounds were small compared to the city cemeteries. A rectangle of land behind the church, a line of old oaks along the back fence, a gravel road that looped like a belt around the main section. The oldest stones were thin and tilted, their letters soft and pale. The newer ones were thick and glossy and almost rude. I mowed, trimmed, raked, and scrubbed bird mess from angels' faces. That was most of it. I was between things. I had a cheap room over the hardware store and a truck that drank oil. My phone screen was cracked and the light bled into my thumb when I typed. I had stopped telling people where I came from and where I was going. It didn't matter. The cemetery didn't ask. On my first morning, the sexton gave me a ring of keys and a map with squared sections labeled A through D. He was a compact man with a neat beard and a stiff way of standing. He told me he'd been at St. Luke's for 30 years and had seen everything people do to the dead. Coins, liquor bottles, condoms, candles that had burned down and melted the grass. He said the usual thing about respect. He pointed at the shed, the tap, the fuel cans, the place where people dump broken ceramic angels and weathered silk flowers. He made me sign for the keys. After that, he left me to it. The first time I saw someone out there who shouldn't have been there, I was edging the row along Section B. The day was flat and mild. The mower vibrated up through my hands into my shoulders and made my elbows feel like glass. I shut it off, wiped sweat on my sleeve, and bent to pull a clump of weeds from the base of a headstone. When I stood, there was a woman standing 3 rows ahead, near a stone I had cleaned earlier that morning. She had a plain gray skirt and a cardigan like a librarian. Her hair was pinned up in a way that looked like work. Not a costume, not vintage, just another time's normal. She stood with her hands folded and her head slightly down. I remember thinking she had the posture of someone who had been told, since childhood, not to take up space. I said hi. I'm not the kind of person who usually says hi, but the cemetery has a way of pressing small kindnesses out of you. She didn't turn. I stepped forward, pushing the mower by the handle, letting its rubber wheels rumble to make my approach obvious. When I reached the end of my row, I looked away to move the cord. It took half a second. When I looked back, she was gone. The headstone where she had stood was for a man named McCrae. The dates were from the 1940s, husband and father. There was a coffee can half buried in the grass beside it with artificial asters folded down into it. I walked the row, checked behind other stones, looked down the line of oaks. The gravel road was empty. I'm not proud to say I got a little angry. Disappearing people only exist in stories and camera tricks. This was a small, open space. There was nowhere to go. The fence was chain link, and the gate was in plain sight. If she'd run or ducked, I would have seen it. I went back to the shed, drank from the warm jug, and told myself she had bent down, and when I moved, she had walked the other way. Or I had misjudged distance, and she had been closer to the road, already turning. The brain does that. It patches holes. 2 days later, I saw a man in a dark suit and a tie that didn't fit. He stood crooked, with his shoulders uneven, and kept touching the knot of his tie like the fabric was hot. He was near Section C, by the veterans' markers with the little flags. I knew those stones well. The sexton made me wash them with extra care. Flags get replaced in spring. Faded ones retired. The man didn't look like he belonged at a military grave. He looked like he had come straight from a cheap funeral parlor that had changed hands too many times. I walked toward him, ready to ask if he needed help finding someone. I swear to you that as I approached, he turned his head and looked at me. Not a full turn, just his eyes sliding in my direction, the whites showing a little under the iris. He raised his hand as if he might wave. I was 6 stones away. Then I blinked and he wasn't there. This is the part where people expect you to start making jokes about too much caffeine or old ghost stories. But nothing in me felt dramatic or strange. I felt like someone had reached out and tugged a thread from my shirt and then hidden it in their fist. That small, that irritating. I stood in the lane of grass and looked at the row of flat markers. There was a little pile of acorns at one corner of a stone, probably a squirrel's stash. The flag on the end holder was snagged with a shred of plastic bag someone hadn't picked up. The air had that hot metal smell you get around chain link in summer. Everything looked normal enough to be insulting. That evening, in my room over the hardware store, I wrote down a list. It's a habit I use when my thoughts start to spread. The list said, sleep, food, heat, noise, drinks, meds, and others. Under sleep, I wrote the hours I'd been getting. Under drinks, I wrote coffee, 2 to 3 cups a day from the gas station. Water, not enough. Under others, I wrote memories, which is my word for the heavier things that try to edge in when it's quiet. If I let memories run the show, everything else starts to wobble. I boxed that word and put the list under the lamp. When I woke in the night, I stared at the ceiling, then climbed down the narrow stairs to the street and walked a slow loop around the block. Most of the stores were dark. The bakery smelled like butter and yeast. A cat watched me from the roof of the real estate office. I didn't think about the woman or the man in the tie until I passed the church and saw the black line of oaks and felt my body lean a little, like a small current had nudged my knee. I didn't go in then. The gate was locked, and I wasn't about to scale it and have to explain myself with a broken toothbrush in my pocket at 2 a.m. I went home and propped my window open with a paperback. The breeze came up and pushed the page edges around like a slow shuffle. The next day, the sexton asked me to reset a fallen stone in Section A. A big one, a family stone with a low base, the surname carved deep enough to catch dirt. I brought the bars and wedges and a bag of gravel. While I levered the weight, a voice behind me said, "Careful." I didn't jump. Good for me. I turned, slow, and saw an older man in a coat, even though the day had warmed up. He was thin in the way of people whose bodies have gone on without appetite. He had a soft brim hat, the kind no one buys anymore. He stood a few yards off with his hands behind his back like a teacher in a museum. "What have you got there?" he asked. "Just resetting," I said. "It sank on one side." "Goes to mud," he said. "This whole corner. That's why they planted those birches. My brother always said they should have put in willow. But I told him, willow is trouble. Willow finds water and kicks ruins into the ground." His voice was thick with the county, that soft crook in the vowel that sounds like you're carrying an egg on your tongue. I nodded because it was a real thing to say. I wedged, rocked, and sighted along the top. The stone came true, or as true as it could. "You do it right," he said. "Try to," I said. When I turned to fetch the bag of gravel, he was gone. There was no slow drifting away. There was no excuse. He was there, and then he was not, and the space where he had been held nothing but warm air, and the birches with their peeling paper bark, and the half shade of leaves with daylight pressed through. I went back to town for lunch and ate a sandwich at the counter that faces Main Street. The mayonnaise was warm and the lettuce tired. I watched people pass. A woman carried a bag of potting soil to her car. A boy rode a bike too small for him. Life had the clear sound of plates stacking and cash drawers ringing, and the door chime at the pharmacy going off each time an old man pushed through with a newspaper tucked under his arm. Nothing in any of it bent even a little toward what I had seen. That afternoon I asked the sexton if anyone else worked the grounds on the days I wasn't there. He said once in a while he called a high school kid for leaf pickup, but the kid would only come on weekends. He asked if I needed help. I said no. He asked, with the quiet curiosity of someone who has learned not to press, if I was settling in okay. I said yes. He nodded and told me we had a burial scheduled for the following week, a Monday, and asked me to make sure the road was clear for the hearse. By the end of the week, I had seen 4 more people who weren't there. A little girl in a dress with a dropped waist, kneeling by a grave so close to the ground that her hair brushed the grass. A heavy woman with a scarf tied tight over her hair, walking between the rows like someone hunting for a mislaid item. A young man in a Letterman jacket with the patch rubbed pale, sitting on a bench under the oaks with both knees pressed together like he didn't know what to do with his hands. Sometimes they looked at me. Sometimes they didn't. Each time I went to them, they went away. I tried speaking once more. I said, "Excuse me." I said, "Can I help you find somebody?" I said, without meaning to, "Stay." The word came out small and embarrassed. The air answered by doing what it always did. It moved the leaves. It moved a strand of hair into my eye. It took my breath and laid it down again like a folded shirt. I started carrying my phone in my pocket. Not because I thought I'd catch anything. I know how that sounds. But because I wanted to have something to hold up between me and the raw feeling that rose in my chest after each disappearance. I took pictures of the stones after a sighting, even when I was sure of their names. Then I went home and matched the photos to the map the sexton had given me. I circled the place names in pencil. I wrote notes beside them like, "Woman in cardigan," "Tie too tight," "Hat." My handwriting went crooked and narrow the way it does when I'm trying not to hurry. I didn't tell anyone. There's a way people watch your face when you tell them something they don't have room for. The corners of their eyes stiffen, and their mouth holds still like they think if they move it, they might say the wrong thing. I didn't want that. Also, I knew enough not to think hearing my own voice say it out loud would make it feel more true. It was already true. It was so true it made the rest of life look like props. Still, I did one thing that might count as telling. I went to the library and asked to look at the old records, the ones that list the purchased plots and the names and the dates. The woman at the desk was new and didn't know where they kept the binders, so she called someone from the back. The someone from the back turned out to be Mrs. DeWitt, who had worked there for as long as I could remember. She didn't know my name, but she looked at me like you look at a kid who used to come in and leave fingerprints on the aquarium glass. "St. Luke's?" she said. "We've got a couple of partials, and I think the church has the full copies, but they don't like them to leave the building." She brought me 3 binders anyway, with plastic covers and brittle pages inside, and a pencil, because pens aren't allowed. I sat at a back table and opened the first binder and breathed the faint smell of old paper that has had many hands. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself a lot of things. I didn't expect the little girl with the dropped waist dress to be in there because how could I know who she was? But I thought I might find the man with the Letterman jacket because I had seen the D stitched on the front. Our high school starts with D. I thought the heavy woman with the scarf might be listed as a mother of someone. I didn't know what I would do if I found them. Put a sticker beside their names and tell the sexton I'd made friends with the dead? But looking felt less useless than sitting. I didn't find the young man. I did find a McCrae who matched the stone where the librarian woman had stood. If she was a librarian, which she might not have been. McCrae had died in the 1940s, like the stone said. The paper notes mentioned a wife named Lette, or Letty. The handwriting wasn't clear. I felt a small jump in my chest. I had not remembered the name wrong on the stone. Then I felt foolish for feeling anything at all. In the second binder, I found an entry for a child with a first name I had always liked, because it sounded agreeable. The date of death was in winter. The note said, "Pneumonia after croup," and the words lifted off the page like a breath that had been trapped. I had to set my hand on the table to hold still. You tell yourself you want to see proofs. That's not really it. You want a chain of steps that leads away from you. You want to be able to point to something and say, I am here because of this, and this came from there. But the binder didn't point. It lay flat and dumb as a floor. Mrs. DeWitt came by and asked if I needed anything. I said no. On her way back to the desk, she said, "It's good you're taking care of that place. A lot of folks think it takes care of itself." I didn't look up, but her voice settled on my shoulders and stayed there. That night I lay awake until I got tired of lying awake and put my boots on and drove back to the church. The moon was small and the cloud cover thin. The parking lot was empty, the slope of it smooth as a swimming pool without water. I stood at the gate and thought about hopping it, and decided that if this was the night I got caught, I wanted a reason better than couldn't sleep. I walked the length of the fence. The oaks suggested a soft ceiling. A breeze pulled through and made the leaves whisper. Not whisper like voices, whisper like leaves. Through the fence I could see the bench under the trees where the young man had sat. I could see the darker rectangle of ground where we had opened and closed a recent plot. I could see, if I squinted, the line of small stones for babies that runs like a quiet ribbon along the low end of Section A. I stood there a long time. I didn't feel anything dramatic. I felt the way you feel when you think you hear your name in a crowd and you turn and it's just noise. But you can't help scanning faces for a certain shape you won't recognize until you see it. I drove home. I slept. In the morning I drank a glass of water and another, and then another, until my stomach felt like it had a lake inside it. I ate a banana, which I always buy and forget to eat. I pulled on my work pants and a shirt that had a bleach stain on the hem. I went to the cemetery and did my work. Around noon, the sexton drove by to drop off forms. He leaned on his car door and said, "You're doing fine. The families notice when it's tidy. They might not say it, but they see." He tapped the forms and said, "Oh, the Watkins plot. Someone left a casserole dish there last week. Did you see it?" "A casserole dish," I said. I pictured a glass rectangle with a lid. Like lasagna. Some people think the dead do more with a casserole than the living do. I put it back by the tap. Don't eat it. I won't, I said. After he left, I took the trimmer and went to Section D. The ground there is uneven and soft. Sometimes when the stump grinder settles after rain, you can put your foot down and the earth will give under your heel. It's not dangerous, just a reminder. A few yards from the Tapley plot, I saw a boy sitting cross-legged in the grass. He was facing away from me. His shirt was striped. His hair was cut in a clumsy bowl. He held something in both hands, small, like a matchbox. He didn't move, not even when I shut off the trimmer and set it down. The silence after a machine cuts off carries a faint echo of the engine, like a throb 2 rooms away. He didn't flinch at that either. "Hey, buddy," I said. "You okay?" He turned his head a little. His ears stuck out more than his skull wanted them to. He didn't turn all the way. I walked closer until I could see the matchbox in his hands. Wasn't a matchbox, but a tiny car with its paint rubbed off. One wheel was stiff. He held the car over the ground like he was listening to an adult explain something about gravity. I stopped 2 steps away and crouched. "Where's your mom?" I asked. He lifted the car and then set it down in the grass. He lifted it again and set it down again. When he raised it a 3rd time, I saw the pale line of the part in his hair. He was a real boy. I felt that recognition like the clasp of a door latch. I said, "Careful. Who are you visiting?" He set the car down a 3rd time. Then he was gone. I didn't shout. I didn't stand up fast. I stayed there in the crouch until my thighs burned and a mosquito landed on my wrist, and I watched it plant its tiny needles and drew my hand away, and it flew off with the heavy, smug tilt all full mosquitoes have. I stood and looked at the grass where he had been. It was pressed down a little, but grass presses easily. I looked at the nearby stones. One said Tapley, like I knew. One said Shaw. One was too worn to read. I ground my mouth shut and carried the trimmer back to the shed. I don't know what you think when you read this. Maybe you think I'm making myself a story because I don't want to have a regular life. Maybe you think there's a gas leak under the cemetery, some soft poison that makes your brain hand you pictures. I thought that too. If there had been a pipe, I would have turned a wrench. That night I bought a little notebook with a green cover and a cheap disposable camera from the pharmacy, because my phone was old enough that the lens fuzzed in low light. The camera felt like a toy in my hand. I also bought an apple and a bottle of water and a pack of mints, because I could not think of what else a person should bring when they are going to sit in a graveyard and wait for people who aren't there. I slept a few hours, woke before dawn, and drove to the church. The air had a bite to it. A mist lifted off the grass and hung a foot above the ground, like someone had laid down a sheet and then forgotten it there. I let myself in with the key the sexton had given me. For work, he'd said, for early starts. I told myself this was an early start. The crunch of gravel under my boots sounded like breaking bones because the whole place was quiet. If you've ever been in a house where the refrigerator has shut off, and you notice finally how loud it had been all along, you know how the dark before day can be. A kind of attentiveness that has no object. I walked to the bench under the oaks and sat down. The bench was damp. I had not thought to bring a towel. My jeans wicked up the cold. I set the camera on my thigh and the notebook on the bench beside me. In the green notebook, on the first page, I wrote the date and the time the way the church puts them on the signboard out front. I wrote where I was sitting and what the weather was like. I wrote that the mist had a border to it that surprised me. It stopped, tidy as a trimmed hedge, where the oaks began. I don't know why that felt like a clue. It did. When the light grew enough to draw shadows, nothing happened. That's a stupid thing to say. 1,000 things happened. Birds woke up. A spider reset a web. The air changed shape. But nothing turned into a person. I opened the mints and let one sit on my tongue until it dissolved. I watched the mist shift and green show through. I waited. I'm good at waiting. It's not a skill that pays. You can't put it on a resume. But it's mine. After a while, I stood and walked my usual route, clockwise. I passed the baby stones and read each name aloud. I thought this might be the sort of thing a person should do if they are waiting for people. I said the names politely, the way you'd introduce yourself to a room. Flowers sagged on the border. A small solar light blinked once and then steadied, confused by the new day. I tucked it so it faced the sun. I moved on to section B and found a patch of grass that had grown too long behind a double stone. I knelt and clippers snipped it down. When I stood, a woman was standing 3 rows ahead. The librarian again, or someone who looked like her, in that same cardigan, that same hair pinned up with care. She was at the McCrae stone. She held one hand in the other, clasped at the waist. Her skirt hung straight, without fuss. "Hello," I said. I said it in a voice I would use in a bank. She did not answer. She did not turn. I lifted the camera, pressed the button, felt the mechanical resistance and the click. The shutter noise was small. When you don't trust your eyes, you reach for a machine. I took 2 more, one with my hand steadier. I lowered the camera and stepped forward. The grass was wet and stuck to my cuffs. I made it 2 stones closer. She was there. I made it 1 stone closer. She was not there. I felt my body shift toward the place where she had stood, like a compass toward north. I went there anyway, and looked down at the McCrae name. I read it like a person trying to read a medicine bottle with the wrong glasses. The date, the dash, the other date, the words carved below, beloved. I squatted and pressed my palm to the stone. It was cool and slick with dew. I sat back on my heels and laughed once, a sound that was not amusement. Then I stood and walked to the bench and clicked the camera advance wheel with my thumb, and told myself I would wait again. I took the roll to the pharmacy in the afternoon. The woman at the counter told me they still sent film out on Wednesdays. I wanted to ask if anyone else in town still used film. Instead, I thanked her and told her I'd be back at the end of the week. She put my name on an envelope with a felt tip marker. I watched her write it because seeing your name in someone else's handwriting has always felt like a proof of life to me. On my way out, I saw the sexton by the church steps, smoking. I didn't know he smoked. He held the cigarette low and tapped ash into a paper cup. He said, "You're in early these days." "Trying to get ahead," I said. "That's a trick," he said. "The grass is like debt. You can pay some, but it grows interest." He looked down the road. "We've got the burial Monday, the Watkins boy. You'll need to mark the line with flags so they don't drive on the irrigation." "I'll do it," I said. He looked at my face the way a person looks at a horizon to see if weather is on it. "You good?" "Yes," I said, and heard that flatness in my voice I use when I don't want anyone to fold my answer into their life. He nodded and tapped his ash, and told me his brother always said to plant willow, and he always said willow is trouble. It was the same sentence he'd said to me before, but his eyes weren't on me when he said it. He was watching a pickup back down the side street with a trailer full of split wood that shifted and knocked in its bindings. That night I dreamed a simple dream of sweeping a floor that had no dirt, only scuffs, and trying to polish the scuffs with my shoe until the shoe left new scuffs, and that tired feeling of wanting a task to stop resisting. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth and the lamp still on. The green notebook lay open on my chest. On the page I had written, before falling asleep, "I don't know what they want." Under that I had written, smaller, "or what I want." The film was ready on Friday. The envelope felt thin. I walked to the diner and ordered coffee and slid the prints out onto the table. The first few were shots I'd taken of the rose, just in case. A stone with the bold oval of a photo glazed into it. A cracked jar. A robin pulling at a worm. Then the 3 photos of the place by McRae's stone. In the first, there was open grass. In the second, open grass. In the third, my hand must have wavered, because the corner of the photo caught a slice of the stone, but still nothing stood in front of it. The prints had that glossy, impersonal shine film gives to nothing. My face went warm. I drank coffee and tilted the prints toward the window, and felt the grunt of something in me lift, and then drop heavy back into place. I don't have a neat explanation for why that empty set of photos made me more certain, not less. It was like the prints made room in my head for both realities to coexist. One where a woman had stood, and one where she had not, and both laid flat on the same page. That punch of contradiction woke me up. It didn't answer me. It just made speaking in doubles feel practical. I kept the camera in my truck after that, the envelope of prints under the seat. I kept the green notebook in my pocket. I wrote down what I saw and where. I wrote the time when I remembered to, not the exact minute. I wrote morning, late morning, after lunch, dusk. I wrote what I had eaten. It felt like the kind of data a real person would gather if he had decided he would not stand in his own way, even if he had to be his own witness. The following Monday, the Watkins burial went as these things go. The family gathered at the graveside under a tent. The minister stood with his little book. The wind tried to take the corner of the tent, and I stood near the peg in case it pulled. And because standing near pegs is the kind of job someone like me always ends up with. The young widow. She must have been young because everyone looked older around her, and she seemed cut out of another picture. Held a child that looked around with the blank serenity of infants. I watched the child blink. I watched the widow's jaw clench. I watched the minister say the words, and the hands of the pallbearers. Boys, really, from the same high school that starts with D, shift and fidget, as if they didn't know where to put their fingers now that the lifting was done. When it was over, the family drifted away in a way that didn't look like drifting, because moving anywhere at all when you've just dropped your own life into the ground feels like too much. The tent sagged. The flowers looked wrong in their careful heaps. The funeral home guys did their stoic, respectful ballet of professional tasks. I folded the chairs and stacked them. I pulled the flags I'd used to mark the irrigation and put them in the bucket. I breathed. When everyone had gone, I took the camera out and stood at the back of the tent and looked at the open earth. A narrow elevator for a person. Dark. It didn't look scary. It looked like work. The backhoe operator watched me and I watched him, and then I put the camera away and went for the plywood sheets we use for the truck tires, so they don't tear up the lawns. When I came back, a woman stood at the lip of the open grave. She had her hands in the pockets of a raincoat that was too short for the weather. The sky was clear. Her raincoat was yellowed like old paper. She looked down into the hole like a person deciding if they can make a jump. I opened my mouth to tell her to step back. Then I closed it, because no sound came. I started toward her, the bucket of flags hanging off my wrist, bumping my leg. She didn't move at all. I took 3 steps. 4. I had the feeling you get when you're almost asleep and you jerk awake because you believe you've stepped off a curb. I took another step and she was not there. I set the bucket down too hard. The flags leapt and clinked. My nails had gone cold and tender, the way they do sometimes before a storm. I looked at the hole and then at the tidy fringe of grass around it and then up at the sky. Clouds were massing to the west. Weather was coming. The backhoe guy, who knew only my first name, said, "You all right?" "Yeah," I said. I said it like a person who had been asked to confirm that water was wet. He shrugged and did his job. Dirt made its blunt scans back into place. Later, after everything was smoothed and tamped, after the flowers had been put back and arranged in a way that tried not to look arranged, I walked the rows once more, and then went to the shed. I leaned against the door with my forehead and felt the grooved wood press marks into my skin. I stood there until my breath settled into a rhythm my body would accept. There are people who would tell you that the dead were trying to speak to me. There are people who would tell you that my mind had pawed a tender spot so often it had made a bruise, and then decided to press on it whenever I went near grass. I don't like either answer. Both make me a single thing when I know I am a handful of things. Let me tell you something else that feels true. Grief has its own weather. Sometimes it moves through you. Sometimes it moves past you. And sometimes you stand in the doorway, and it stares at you from the yard, not coming in, not leaving. That week a rumor went around the town that kids had been taking selfies at St. Luke's after dark. The sexton asked me to keep an eye out for beer cans and foil wrappers. He talked about respect. I said yes. I drove a slow loop through the lot after my shift ended and found nothing but cigarette butts and a plastic comb with 2 teeth missing. I swept the walk anyway. The sky had broken open at dusk and made an ugly sunset, the kind that stains everything with a raw color. I locked the gate and then stood outside it, listening to a dog bark 3 streets over. I stood there until the dog stopped. I turned to go, and a man was standing by the corner of the wall, touching the brick like you touch a thing to know it's real. He had that same Letterman jacket the other boy had worn, the D paled with age. But this man was older than the boy on the bench. His hairline had started to go. He wore the jacket like a person wears a shirt from a team they're not on anymore and goes to the game anyway. It looked wrong on him and also, somehow, right. He didn't look at me. He looked at the brick. He pressed his palm there once, and then another time, higher, as if he wanted to match a memory to a spot. "Hey," I said. Soft, I didn't move closer. His shoulders lifted with a breath. I felt a small thing open in me. He lowered his hand, turned a fraction, and in the angle of his face I thought I saw a person I had known as a teenager. The nose, the mouth when it wasn't smiling. There are faces that fall into your memory like a stone into a pond, and the ripples are still there years later if you look hard at the right angle. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. He would be 40 now, and somewhere else. I took one step. He set his hand back on the brick as if to steady himself. I said, "Do you need?" And the wall held nothing. The bloom of color on the brick shifted as the last of the light flattened and went gray. I didn't sleep that night. When the sky lifted its edge to make room for morning, I left my apartment and drove back to the church. I took my camera and the notebook and a thermos of coffee that tasted like metal. I sat on the bench again. I wrote in the notebook. I wrote, "It's not that they vanish. It's that I catch up to where they aren't." I stayed until the sun rose and made ordinary shadows out of shapes that had looked like more. Then I got up and did my job because I had to do my job. You can't have a cemetery let itself go. Grass makes a fool of anybody who ignores it. I mowed. I trimmed. I picked up a soda can someone had tucked behind a stone and placed it in the bin. I straightened a flag. I did not see anyone. The day made its easy sound again, and the gulls cut their errands across the sky. At lunch, I sat with my back against the shed. The shade there is thin. A splinter poked into my shoulder through the fabric of my shirt. I didn't move. I let the splinter make its shallow point, and then stayed there anyway. A woman walked through the gate with a bunch of flowers and a look on her face that said she wanted this to be quick and private. I kept my eyes on my sandwich. When she left, I stood and stretched and went back to work. Near the end of the day, I came to a stone with a jar of button flowers in front of it. Actual buttons, threaded onto wire, strung into silly, spiky blooms. They were faded in the way plastic fades. The name on the stone was one I liked. It had a click in the middle. I'd trimmed it a dozen times. A man stood beyond it, at the path, looking down with his head bent. His jacket had elbow patches. You don't see elbow patches much anymore. He had a haircut you could have cut at home. Careful. He stood very still. I lifted the trimmer to my shoulder and walked around the stone. I took 3 steps around the jar and felt a small hope rise. It was the size of a pill. I took 2 more steps and he was not there. The hope went nowhere. It did not burst. It did not sink. It just waited and then turned into the next hour. That night I laid everything I had on my kitchen table. The green notebook, the envelope of photos, the cemetery map, the binder notes I'd copied from the library and tucked into my pocket, the church's form for the Watkins burial, with the time and the location, and the signature from the funeral director. The table looked like a small police station, the kind in a show that can't afford a large set. I poured the coffee that had gone cold without me into the sink and listened to it make a hollow sound in the drain. I turned the tap. The water ran. I washed the mug and set it upside down. I sat. I opened the notebook. I wrote, in big letters like a teacher on a board, "What am I trying to prove?" Sometimes you think you want answers when what you want is permission. I wanted permission to keep going. I wanted to know which of the 2 realities deserved my time. I wanted, if we're honest, to be chosen by something. The dead, or my own ordinary life. It's greedy to want that. But I did. I went back to St. Luke's the next morning and asked the sexton if the church had a list of unmarked graves. He cocked his head and asked me why. I said I'd noticed some stones out of line and I wondered if the ground hid a plot that had never gotten a marker. He pursed his mouth and told me about the old section, the bit of land that had been added in the 20s without proper mapping, the poor box plots that only got a board that rotted away. He said, "We don't tell families if we can help it. It makes them mad that we don't know exactly where everyone is." "Do you know?" I asked. He made an uncertain turn of his hand. "We know enough not to cut through them with a trench. But if you asked me to point to each one, I'd be guessing." He squinted at me. "Why are you interested?" "Because the ground gives under my boots in spots where it shouldn't," I said, which was true. He nodded at that. He gave me a manila folder with photocopies. "Keep this for a day," he said. "Bring it back to me. Don't leave it in the shed." I took the folder into the church, because the sanctuary is quiet in a way even a graveyard isn't. It has a particular silence, the sound of wood and high ceilings and air that's been asked to hold words in it. I sat in the back pew and opened the folder, and the photocopies made their soft, dry sound. The unmarked list had columns for name and year and approximate location. A lot of the names were first names only, or infant with a surname, or unknown. Reading unknown is a plain hurt. The page made my heart feel the size of my mouth. Halfway down the second sheet, I saw the surname McCrae again. I wrote the row number in my notebook. I didn't know why that felt like something. I only knew it did. I closed the folder and sat there until the sexton walked down the aisle in his rubber-soled shoes and said, "Gentle, you all right in here?" And I said yes again, because I did not know how to say another thing. Out in the cemetery, the sky had gone to an even gray, the kind of day that makes everything honest. You can see as far as the air allows. I walked the rows and matched the numbers to what I knew. Some sections are like that, mobile in memory, fixed on paper. The birches made their papery sound. The chain link hummed a little with the wind. I stopped by the bench under the oaks, the place where I had sat and watched the mist have its border, and felt the weight of the morning in my pocket, as if the notebook had gained mass. I decided to go out that night and stay. Not a loop at the fence, not a brief sit with a mint. I would bring a better light and the thermos and a second roll of film. I would sit and let the place be itself for as long as I could manage. And if I saw them, I would not run at them like a dumb kid playing tag. That's what I'd been doing, I realized. I had been rushing toward them, as if closeness would make them keep. That's not how anything keeps. It was nothing you would notice in a house. It was not a skitter, not a scrape, not an animal. It was the small sound an object makes when air pressure changes, a paper lifting, a plastic jug popping itself back into shape. I turned my head and saw the envelope of photos I kept on the shelf slide a fraction of an inch forward. It was balanced badly. The nudge brought it to the edge. It fell. It didn't open. It hit the packed dirt and stayed sealed. I stared at it. I didn't move right away because if I bent to pick it up and there was someone standing in the doorway when I stood back up, I didn't know what I would do with my face. I waited. The shed held its calm shape. The light coming through the high, dirty window painted a little bright rectangle on the opposite wall. The envelope lay on the floor where gravity had put it. I bent and picked it up. The paper was cool. I set it back on the shelf. I made sure it was fully on the wood. I stood there a little longer, long enough to know I wasn't trying to catch anything. Then I walked out into the open air and let the day take me. That evening, because I am not a person who can leave a question unmoved, I went back to the library. I asked for the binders again. Mrs. DeWitt brought them and her pencil, and the look that lives between concern and habit. I opened the binder with the McCrae page and looked again at the dates and the notes and the little bit about Letty. I wrote the page number in my notebook and drew a small box around it. Then, for no reason I could explain to myself, I asked if they had any photographs of the town from the 40s, people at church picnics, anything like that. She brightened the way people do when you ask them for something they know how to give. She brought me a fourth binder, this one filled with photocopies of photocopies, faces washed pale by time, edges of dresses lost in a haze of light. I turned the pages slowly. Boys in suspenders with hair parted halfway across their heads, girls in skirts that ended at the calf, a pie contest, a church step, a second-place ribbon pinned to a small chest. It was all normal, and it lifted a feeling in me that was not sadness, but its cousin. Halfway through, I saw a photo of a group of women standing by a table with white paper cups and a big glass jug of lemonade with slices floating like flowers. The women had their hands folded or held at the waist or reaching for a cup. One of them wore a cardigan. Her hair was pinned up. She had a plain mouth. She was not the woman I had seen, or she was. The photocopy had rubbed the picture down until it barely held. I held my breath and then let it go. It did not prove or disprove anything. It only made a shape in my chest that I would recognize now if I felt it again. I closed the binder and thanked Mrs. DeWitt and walked down the steps into the early evening. The street smelled like dust and dry leaves. A boy in a hoodie kicked a bottle cap across the road. The crunch of it under his shoe made a delicate protest. I went home and sat on the edge of my bed with the green notebook open in my hands and my pen resting on the margin. I looked at the notes I had made about staying still and touching nothing. I thought about how the woman had stayed longer that afternoon. I thought about the envelope falling. I thought about how, when I started this, I had been sure these small things would add up to an answer. Now, sitting there, it felt like they added up to a different thing. An obligation. I had not expected this. Every story like this, the ones people tell and the ones they pretend they don't believe, leans toward a confrontation, or a revelation, or a madness. I didn't feel any of that. I felt like I had been handed a job. It didn't have a title and it didn't pay, but the tools were familiar. Patience, attention, a certain gentle respect that a person can do even when their own life is bent at the middle. I wrote, "Tonight, again." Then I crossed it out. Then I wrote, "Soon." I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. The streetlight made a stripe across the ceiling. Outside, someone laughed, the short laugh of someone telling a story that is not unkind. I closed my eyes and saw the woman's hand lift and lower, and the yellowed raincoat near the open earth, and the boy's car, and the way the man had pressed his palm to the brick, as if he could press himself back through it. I slept. In the morning, the first thing I did was buy a new roll of film. I didn't plan to become someone who sleeps better in a graveyard than in a bed, but that's what happened. Not because I was brave or foolish, It was because sitting there felt like matching my breathing to a clock I didn't make. I could be wrong about what the clock was, but it ticked. The next nights were quiet in the way that would sound like nothing if I wrote it down as a list. I brought the thermos and the apples. I brought the camera because I couldn't help it. I sat on the bench under the oaks with the green notebook open to whatever page I had left off on, and my pen tucked in the spiral. I wrote the date, and then sometimes sat dumb with the pen uncapped while nothing in my head lined up into words. They came and went. Sometimes it was the boy with the car. Once it was the man with the tie again, the knot tight at his throat, as if he had tried to fix it and made it worse. He had a tired face and stood with his weight on one leg and then the other like his shoes hurt. He looked the way a person looks when they are almost ready to go home from a place where they don't belong, except the place they're going back to isn't theirs either. He didn't stay long. None of them did, except the woman in the cardigan. And even she never stayed as long as I wanted. I kept my promise to my own hands. I did not stand and close the gap. I let the distance do its work. I started to understand that my urge to cross it was my problem, not theirs. During the day, I did my job the way jobs should be done, predictable and a little boring. The sexton trusted me. He left small notes in the shed with a paperclip and his square letters. Trim D rows 6 to 12. Be careful of sink. Or remove wreaths older than 1 month. Set aside the ones with wooden forms. Or pump has a hiccup. Jiggle the switch. I did all that. I fixed the pump's hiccup by doing nothing at all. The pump fixed itself. We like to take credit, but most things just go back to right when you stop fiddling with them. Once, in the early afternoon, the Watkins widow came back with a vase wrapped in newspaper. I saw her from across the loop and told myself to keep moving so she could be alone. She walked with a slow sway, the baby on her shoulder. The child looked over her back with that mild, blank baby gaze like he was watching a show about nothing that had him wholly. She knelt and unwrapped the glass and set it down and touched the dirt with 2 fingers, like she was checking if it was dry enough for seeds. Then she stood and went away, and I trimmed the opposite side of Section C very carefully and felt like a thief, even though I was doing my job. A storm blew up 2 days later, not the kind that makes the news. The kind that slides in and drops a hard hour of water and goes. The birches shook like dogs. The chain link hummed. When it ended, the clouds sat low and flat and broke the day into a gray that had no depth. I walked the rows to check for branches and found one stone tilted forward a degree more than it had leaned before. I noted it on the map to tell the sexton, by the old added lot. Near the poor box rows, the ground had sunk into a long, shallow oval. Water had collected in it and shined like a mirror. It wasn't much, but it was a shape in the earth that looked like something had been there and then left. The grass at the edges was flattened in little arcs. I squatted and touched the mud with my finger, and it came away with grit and the smell that I know from planting tomatoes in bad years. Wet that would take days to leave. I saw nothing in the water but the reflection of the birches and my own shoulder. But after I stood while I walked away, I felt the oddest tug in the middle of my chest. Not pain, just a feeling like a hand had put 2 fingers there as if to check my pulse. I turned back. The oval held its small shine. The air kept its gray mouth closed. I took a picture because that's what I had decided to do when I didn't know what else to do. The camera clicked, and the noise answered to nothing. That night I brought a rain poncho even though the storm was over, because I needed to feel like I could prepare for a thing and then not waste the preparation. I sat under the oaks again and watched the clouds travel in a slow rip toward town. The streetlights out on the road made a weak glow. I flipped through my notebook and counted the pages I'd filled. More than I would have guessed if I'd been told to write this much about anything else. I would have said I didn't have it in me. I saw the woman in the cardigan again. She stood with her hands folded the way she always did. I did not move. I thought about saying a name, Letty, and did not, because it wasn't my place to hang a name from the air. The urge passed. She lifted her head toward the baby row, the same little angle as before, and I followed her look because ignoring it felt rude. I saw the line of small stones lit by streetlight spill, then the darkness swallow the spill back. When I looked at her again, she was gone. I nodded, to no one, because I needed to mark the fact of her in some physical way. I took the film to the pharmacy when the roll was done. The clerk asked if I wanted doubles. I said no. Part of me thought I wasn't supposed to show these to anyone else, not because of a rule, but because it would invite a conversation I didn't want. I didn't want to listen to someone try to hand me belief or disbelief. Both would be heavy. When I picked up the envelope a week later, the pictures were the same as before. The place where someone had stood, and now there was air. On two of them, there was a smudge in the corner where the camera had caught a drip on the lens. It looked like something because I wanted it to. It wasn't anything. I put the photos back in the envelope and went to the diner and ate a BLT that had too much mayonnaise and didn't hate the taste. The sexton called me into the church office one morning to help move a cabinet. It was heavy with bulletins and old music and a box with a label that said, "Banners Red." While we slid the cabinet away from the wall, he said, like a man offering a fact about weather, "You're out there at odd hours." I answered with the plain truth. "I don't sleep very well at home." He nodded. "It's quiet there. I guess that helps." "I'm not sure what helps," I said. "It's not my business what you do," he said. "But if anyone asks, we both know you get in early sometimes to get a jump on the day. That's the story I tell. It's not a lie." "I appreciate that," I said. He paused, leaned on the cabinet, and looked at the dusty floor like it might go on talking if he waited. "People tell stories about the place," he said. "They always have. If you stay in one place long enough, you hear all the versions. I don't tell them myself, not because I don't believe people see what they see, but because I don't think stories help a person keep a place tidy." He lifted his eyes to me. "Keep it tidy. That's the job. The rest will do what it does whether you tell it to or not." "I can do tidy," I said. He nodded. We put the cabinet against the opposite wall and he said, like he was telling me where the mop was, "I don't like Willow." It's trouble he smiled to show he knew he'd told me that before. I thought then, for a second, about telling him what I had seen. I imagined saying, "They show up. They stand. They leave." I imagined him listening, and then choosing a drawer in his mind for the information. I didn't do it. The scene was too clear. I didn't want to hand him something that would sit in his pocket and scrape at his fingers when he reached in for his keys. On a Tuesday, a man from the county came to look at the sink in the poor box section. He wore a vest with reflective stripes and carried a roll wheel, the kind that clicks off distance. He walked around the oval and then around the section, measuring, muttering a little under his breath. I stayed back, because you don't crowd a person who is trying to match the world to a number. He made some notes, and then came to me and asked if we had a map of the plot boundaries. I brought him the sexton's copy, the one with pencil smudges and coffee stains, and he bent over it and jabbed his finger at the corner. He said he'd bring Phil, but he didn't like to do much more without a plan. He had the cautiousness of a man who had seen the inside of more than one lawsuit. "What do you think made it?" I asked, because I wanted to hear him say something ordinary like water or roots. "Water," he said, like a man doing his job right. "Might be a pipe under there that moved, if there was one at all. Might be nothing. It's all guessing until you dig." He looked up at the birches. "Those'll drink a lot. People like them because they look nice. They're thirsty, though." "I've heard," I said. He left. I walked to the oval, which had dried to a dull, damp color. I wanted to draw a line around it in chalk so I'd know if it spread. That felt like the kind of thing a person would do who wanted to name what he was doing as investigation instead of sitting and watching. I didn't have chalk. I put a twig at one edge and another at the opposite edge. It was nothing. It made me feel like a person who had made an effort. At dusk, a woman came with a dog on a leash and walked the loop and nodded at me and said she liked the quiet here. The dog looked at me and then at a spot 2 feet to my left, the way dogs do when they are trying to be polite and also manage their own concerns. I nodded at both of them. When she left, I sat on the bench and thought about the dog's look. It didn't mean anything. It meant exactly what it was. People who want to tell themselves tales will grab anything and make it into a handle. One morning, early, before the mist had burned off, I saw someone I knew. Not a trick of resemblance, not a wish. He stood near Section B, hands in his pockets, head bent. He was my age now, or close enough. He had a scar at the corner of his mouth that he'd gotten from a bicycle pedal when he was 14. I knew him from school. We weren't friends then. He had his own orbit. I was nobody you'd invite on purpose. He looked at a stone with a name I didn't recognize, one of the newer ones, smooth and serious. He shifted his weight and blew out a breath through his nose. He was unmistakably himself, aged by a fair number of years, softened at the eyes, a little heavier in the middle. I stood where I was and watched. I didn't say his name. We grew up. Some of us left. Some of us stayed. I had heard he had moved away. I had not heard anything else. He didn't vanish. He finished what he was doing, which was nothing more than standing and facing a stone. And then he turned and walked toward the gate. He didn't see me. I watched him go. He pushed the gate open, and it made the same small noise it makes for everyone. I stood there feeling a stupid mix of relief and disappointment. I had prepared for the dead and held still for them. The living still had their own way of touching a day. The county sent a crew to bring a load of fill dirt. We raked it into the sink by the poor box section, and the oval looked less like itself afterward. Smoothed over, edged to match the rest of the ground. Later that week, I saw a woman stand over that same spot and fix her eyes on a point that meant something to her, and then look confused for a second, like a person reaching for a coat hook in the dark that has always been there, and suddenly is not. She stood a moment longer and then left. I touched the air above the spot when she was gone and felt nothing but air. At the library, I kept going through the binders. They were badly organized in the way that happens when many people care just enough to do part of a job, but no one has time to make a system. I liked them for that. It means there's no one to perform for. I copied down more names, matched more rows. The McCrae entry didn't change. Neither did the unknowns I thought, a couple of times, of asking Mrs. DeWitt if she had ever seen anything at St. Luke's when she was younger. That type of question. But I didn't. People earn their quiet. If she had something to tell me, she had already decided whether she would. Summer tipped toward late. The oaks kept their sure sound. The grass did what grass does. I started taking my boots off when I sat on the bench at night, because my feet ached in the middle where the arch is supposed to be. A stray cat found the shed and decided it was hers. I started putting a bowl of water outside the door in the shade. She drank and watched me with the aloof honesty that cats carry around like a flag. On a Sunday afternoon, the church held a picnic on the back lawn beyond the fence. It felt odd to hear all that noise on the other side. The slap of a volleyball, a child crying, a voice on a small microphone calling out the pie winners. I kept working because that was my lane. A few people wandered along the fence and peered in like zoo visitors. A teenager threw a frisbee and it sailed over and landed in Section C. He came to the gate and asked if he could fetch it. I let him in. He jogged to the disc, picked it up, and paused by a stone to read it. He stood quiet for a second, and then came back and thanked me and left. His face had a look I couldn't read. Maybe the stone had a name he knew. Maybe it didn't. Maybe he just felt the place press a little into his shirt. That night, the same teenager showed up with two friends. They loitered by the gate and then came in because it wasn't locked yet. I walked the loop toward them with a rake over my shoulder, and they got the message that this wasn't the place to linger. They left, not rudely. After they were gone, the letterman man stood by the wall where the teenager had paused earlier. Letter on his chest faded, hand on the brick like a man measuring himself against the corner. I kept walking. I didn't stop because stopping would have taken the air out of both of us. When I came around again, he wasn't there. Later, while I was closing the gate, a woman in her 60s stopped and told me her parents were in Section A, and she always liked how tidy the row looked. I thanked her. She said she had lost 3 sets of sunglasses in the last month and blamed that on getting older. She laughed at herself. The laugh turned into a kind of breath. She wiped her eye with the heel of her hand and said she still came by most weeks because it made the week make sense. I wanted to say, me too, even though I wasn't sure if that would make sense outside my own head. I told her to have a good evening, and she told me not to work too hard, because the grass always wins, and drove away. I started to write more in the notebook, not just the names and places and times. I wrote about the small tasks. I wrote, moved the solar lights so they face south, scraped bird mess off the angel on the Gallagher stone, heavy wind, check flags again. Then I wrote a line beneath each day that said whether I'd seen anyone. Saw the boy, saw the scarf, or saw no one. Some pages had nothing but work. Some had only the word saw, and a line next to it with nothing written on it. That wasn't on purpose. It matched what was happening. I don't know if it was the change in the light when August got long, or if it was me. But the feeling I had when they appeared began to be different. Less like a snap in my chest, more like noticing a small bird land on a fence. You know it might lift off again any second. You let it be there while it is. When it goes, you don't ask the air to explain itself. I did sit with one new thing. One night, as the town made itself smaller, I took the green notebook and turned to a new page and wrote, very slow, "If they don't want anything, what is this for?" I didn't put a question mark because it poked at the end in a way that felt wrong. I stared at the words. I waited to see if any other words came. They didn't. I closed the book and put both hands on it and kept them there like it might slip away. Around that time, the sexton's brother died. It wasn't a surprise, but when it happens, the surprise is that the world goes on with all parts still attached. The sexton went to the service and then took 2 days off, and I said I would handle anything that came up. I could tell he didn't want to say thank you. He wanted to say something else and didn't know what. We settled on work. I moved hoses and cut the narrow strips along the road where it's easy to miss. I carried the trash out and set it where the town truck could reach it. On the second day, a funeral director called the office and asked if he could pre-drive the loop for a funeral scheduled for the end of the week. I said yes. He came in a tidy black car with tissue paper napkins stuffed in the little side compartments. We walked the loop and talked about the dip near Section D and how he should swing wide around the Oaks. He nodded and said he'd tell the driver. He asked how long I'd been at St. Luke's. I said not long. He said some cemeteries felt better to be in than others, and he couldn't tell you why. I didn't answer because agreement would mean parsing what better was. He clapped my shoulder a little like a coach and left. That afternoon, while the air held still and waited for a breeze that didn't come, I went to the poor box section with a bag of grass seed. I scattered it over the fill dirt and raked it in soft. I watered it with the hose from the tap. The seeds stuck to the damp and made the ground look like it had freckles. I stood there with the hose in my hand and felt the calm that comes from doing something small that is completely right for 5 minutes. I shut the water off and coiled the hose back to the last loop because I can't stand to leave a loop half on, half off. When I turned around, the woman in the yellowed raincoat stood on the edge of the damp spot. Her hands were still in her pockets. She looked down. She leaned forward half an inch, like a person looking into a shallow drawer. I watched her. She didn't turn her head. She exhaled once in a way that moved her shoulders, and then she was not there. The damp spot was the damp spot. The seeds looked like seeds. I said out loud, because the air felt like someone should say something. Okay. It was not an answer. It was a place marker. I began to understand something that had been sitting in the corner of what I knew like a chair no one uses. They were not there for me. They were not performing. They were not broken in a way that I could fix. If anything, they were whole in a way that didn't make room for me. They had their agenda, and I had mine. The overlap was a short line if you measured it, but standing inside it felt like a job. There was one more shift I haven't mentioned. It's small, but a person like me counts small things. In the shed, the envelope of photos fell off the shelf again. It fell when no one was in the shed but me. It fell the way things fall when the air in a room changes pressure, or when a door shuts in the house at the front. I can't say what made it happen. I can say the envelope slid and dropped, and I picked it up and put it back, and then stood for a long moment with my hand resting on the top edge, as if that would keep the world obedient. Then I took the envelope out of the shed and put it under the seat of my truck. And the next day I brought it back, because putting it under the seat didn't feel right either. Once the green notebook fell too. I was in the middle of a page, the pen tucked in the spiral, and a little wash of air went through the shed, and the notebook slid to the edge and tipped and landed spine first on the floor. The pen came loose and rolled toward my boot. I bent and picked both up and set them on the shelf and said, "Okay," again, as if I were talking to a person who would admit what they'd done. The shed did not change shape. The cat came around the corner and looked at me with those gold eyes that say she will leave whenever she wants. At this point, you'd think I would look for a story that made these things line up into a line of cause and effect. I did that in my head a little because everyone does. But I refused to give the story a single name. Poltergeist, nerves, air. I kept the names laid out like tools. On some days I used one, on some days another. Most days I used none. This is the part I haven't wanted to write because it's neat, and I don't trust neatness. One night I fell asleep on the bench. The thermos sat by my boot, and the camera strap was around my wrist, and the notebook lay open on my chest, the pages moving a little with my breath. I woke to the sound of people walking in dry leaves. Not loud. The sound you hear at a distance when you think, for a second, you're not alone. I lifted my head. I didn't jerk. I let it come up in the slow way that doesn't scare certain animals. The oak stood over me. The air had an edge to it the way air does when it's about to cool for real. I looked out across the rows and saw them. They didn't stand singly, separated in those precise places I had marked on my map. They stood together, in the way people stand when a service is over, and they haven't decided if they're leaving yet. They kept a respectful distance from one another like strangers do. A dozen? More? I couldn't count. Counting would have made it false. The sizes of them were different. The heights, the ages, a man with a hat, a woman with a scarf, a boy. Two older women side by side, not touching. They were not a group. They were several lives that had been left on the lawn at the same time. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't try to breathe quietly or loudly. I breathed. My hands lay on my thighs because they needed something easy to do. One of the figures shifted her weight, and I thought it was the woman in the cardigan. But it wasn't. Or it was. And it didn't matter because they were as much each other as they were themselves, when seen all at once like that. Their attention wasn't on me, and it wasn't on the stones. It was on something I couldn't see, because it had nothing to do with sight. I could not tell you how I knew that, any more than I could tell you how I know when a driver beside me is going to change lanes without signaling. The body knows some things with or without permission. They didn't fade. They didn't go up like smoke. They were there and then they weren't. The lawn was the lawn again. The rows were the rows. The air was the same air as before. I felt a pressure in my chest loosen, the way a bad knot gives a little when you stop fighting it. I looked down at the notebook on my lap. The page was blank except for the small, slow sentence I had written earlier. What is this for? The pen in the spiral had a nick in the plastic from where something had caught it. Not new, old. I smoothed the page with my palm. The paper made that small breath sound paper makes when you touch it. After that, I got practical. It might not sound like it, but that's what happened. I made a second copy of the map with my notes and kept it in a zip bag in the drawer under the spare trimmer cord. I made a third copy and gave it to the sexton without the circles and the numbers I had added. I told him I wanted an extra in the office in case something happened to the shed. He said that was a good idea. I wrote a short list on a clean page in the green notebook and labeled it Work to Teach. It had mix gas at 50-1 and don't trust the hour meter and hornets in the blue palette, move with care, and spring flag replacements go in the right-hand desk drawer. Then I added 2 lines that no one would ask for. Read names and hands on thighs. I don't know who I was writing for. I could say I was writing for the person who came after me, as if I was going somewhere. That wasn't it. I was writing for the part of me that would forget, because we always do. I needed a way to bring myself back to what I could do when my head tried to drag me somewhere I couldn't go. I don't know if this is the ending you wanted because I don't know what you hoped this would do. If you wanted a thing with a door that swings open and a voice that tells you where to go, I can't give you that. If you wanted a neat shape that makes the rest of your week feel balanced, I can't give you that either. I can give you the shape I made for myself so I wouldn't trip over my own feet. For me, it goes like this. I get up. I drink water. I go to St. Luke's. I keep the loop clear. I stand flags back up after wind. I sweep off the angel faces. I pick up cans and pull silk petals out of the grass. I check the chain on the gate. I fix what I can fix. I go home. At night, if the air feels like it will let me, I go sit under the oaks, and I let my back find the right place against the bench so my shoulders don't knot. I set the green notebook on my lap and write down what happened if anything happened. And if nothing happened, I write nothing. They come. They stand. Sometimes one looks toward the baby row. Sometimes a man touches brick. Sometimes a boy's fingers curl around a car with the paint rubbed off. They don't look at me. They're not mine. If I move, I do it slow. If I speak, I say a small hello into my chest, where it can bounce and not be rude. When they go, the grass keeps being grass. The morning comes with whatever light it has been given. The county will keep exploring and measuring when the budget tells them to. The sexton will keep reminding me to mind the willow that isn't there. Mrs. DeWitt will bring me binders when I ask, and will not say what she isn't ready to say. The widow will come less often, and then not at all, and then maybe again after a long time when she needs the shape of the place to hold her a minute. The teenager who threw the frisbee will forget which stone he paused at, and only remember the feel of the fence on his hand when he leaned on it to catch his breath. The cat will get bolder in spring, and then go off to have kittens somewhere I won't find. The camera will show me 4 more photos of blank grass, and I'll tuck them into the envelope with the others, and I won't know why I keep buying film, except that I like the proof of the envelope in my hand. The map will get softer at the folds. The green notebook will fill up, and I'll buy another one. And I won't like the new one at first, because new things pretend to be better when they are only not used yet. Sometimes in a mood that has nothing to do with dark or light, I will think about leaving. I have thought that thought my whole life. I will picture a road with a diner at the edge, and a room with a different window, and a job with a different set of keys. Then I will go to St. Luke's, and the oaks will give me their sure sound, and the birches will peel their paper the way they do. And someone will have left a plastic angel whose head needs gluing, and I will fix that, and I will forget to leave again. If there is a lesson here, it's small and not useful if you want to sell it. Show up. Keep your hands where you can see them. Read the names. Keep the place tidy. Let them keep their side. When the envelope falls, put it back. When the notebook moves, pick it up without trying to make it into a constitution. When the boy lifts the car, let that be a thing that happens in front of you. If you have to do something, sit down. I'll tell you one last thing because it keeps slipping out of my head, and I don't want to forget it. One morning at the edge of winter and spring, when the ground was muddy and the air was light with a cold that pretends to be warmer than it is, I sat on the bench and dozed. When I woke, 2 blades of grass lay across my knees in crude little hyphens, one on each leg, the way I had put them there once months ago. Maybe they stuck to my cuff from a walk and fell like that by chance when I shifted. It's a good chance. Maybe the cat hopped up and put them there with a paw because that's a trick cats do when no one is looking. Maybe the wind. Maybe the bench itself wanted to have its say. I looked at them. I lifted each with a fingertip and set them down beside me. I left them there. I wrote in the notebook. Hyphens again. I underlined it once, not twice. When I stood to go, I put my palm on the bench slat and felt the cold wood and thought of the woman with the cardigan lifting her hand and lowering it, and the man with the hat putting his hand away in his pocket. And I put my hand back on my thigh because I had not been asked to do anything more. I turned, and the oaks were exactly where they had always been, making their quiet sound, patient as water wearing a stone down grain by grain. I walked the loop one last time to check for trash. I found a bottle cap and a candy wrapper and a screw that had shaken itself loose from something I couldn't name. I put them in my pocket because that's what you do when you don't know where a thing belongs yet. Then I locked the gate and stood a moment on the sidewalk. The town went on. The day had not asked me to solve it. That's it. That's all the last half amounts to. The ground settling, the air doing what it does, the line I stand in getting clearer because I decide to stand in it. A place where the dead pass through the way weather does, and a person sitting on a bench with his hands on his thighs, choosing not to cross a line that doesn't belong to him. If you need more, I can't give it. If you need less, that's fine too. I'll be out there anyway, sweeping off angels, reading the names, letting the grass win when it wants to, and staying still when that's the only thing that seems like a kind of work.